This November, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary. Theirs is one royal marriage that has stood the test of time and helped keep the monarchy secure. But back in the 1940s, when the teenage Elizabeth fell for the dashing Philip, it was a very different story. In the eyes of her family, courtiers and the public, the young Prince Philip of Greece was a far from ideal son. Rough, uneducated, and not likely to be faithful, thought the court. Rather unpolished, Teutonic, Charlie Kraut. In a newspaper poll, nearly half the nation was against the match.
Definitely no to a marriage with a foreign prince.
But luckily for the couple, there was a third person in this romance. Philip's Uncle Dickie, Lord Louis Mountbatten, fixer extraordinaire. This is the forgotten story of a royal love match fraught with a series of obstacles, and how, through behind-the-scenes manipulation, Philip's Uncle Dickie helped pull it off. Just. The story begins in 1939. Elizabeth was 13 years old, the heir to the throne, and a serious-minded girl of strong feelings. Prince Philip of Greece was 18, a handsome young sailor of uncertain prospects. And Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, was a very ambitious man with a passion for intrigue. That summer, on the eve of war, all three were to meet. In July 1939, the royal family visited the Royal Naval College, Dartmouth in Devon. A young cadet joined the party, Prince Philip of Greece, who was training at Dartmouth for the British Navy.
He was very dashing, he certainly was. He was somebody that you would certainly look at if he came into the room, because you think, oh, who is this good-looking young man?
Elizabeth and Philip played croquet, and the scene was captured by a passing amateur photographer. The princess was smitten by the good-looking, much older cadet.
I think at that age one is rather enthralled by brave young men who go to war. And I always suspect that the love affair sort of was originally kindled there.
Mountbatten, as the King's naval ADC, was also there that day, and he noticed Elizabeth's interest in his nephew. After a visit to the royal yacht, the Victoria and Albert, he recorded in his diary. Philip came back aboard the V&A for tea and was a great success with the children. Mountbatten was a man of immense personal and dynastic ambition. As a second cousin of George VI, he was on the fringes of the royal family, but he wanted to put himself and the Mountbattens centre stage. He had been a close friend of Edward VIII, but he'd lost that connection when Edward abdicated. Now Mountbatten could see a new route to the royals through his good-looking nephew, Philip.
He was an inveterate matchmaker. He was certainly determined to find a suitable match for his nephew, Prince Philip. And could there be a better match than the heir presumptive to the British throne? I think not.
But Mountbatten's idea of a future match between Elizabeth and Philip was littered with obstacles. For the future Queen of England, his background was far from ideal. Like Elizabeth, Philip was royal, and the pair were distant cousins. He too was one of the many descendants of Victoria and Albert's prolific brood, but he was from one of the less illustrious branches. His grandfather, Prince William of Denmark, was in 1863 imported by the Greeks to be their king. In royal terms, the Greek monarchy was poor. It was also one of the least stable in Europe. In 1922, following an unsuccessful war with Turkey, Philip's father, Prince Andrew, a general in the Greek army, was forced to flee the country. The family's downward slide had begun.
Prince Philip was thrown out of Greece with all his family when he was a baby. He never, in effect, knew Greece as a young man at all. And from then on, they led a pretty harem-scarum life.
They lived in exile in Paris, Philip and his 4 older sisters wearing hand-me-downs from richer relatives. The strain of their circumstances soon told on the family.
Before he was 10, Prince Philip's parents split up. His mother had a kind of nervous breakdown. It sounds like a form of manic depression. She was incarcerated in a clinic in Switzerland. The consequence was that she didn't see her family, wasn't in touch with Prince Philip, literally for years on end. Not a postcard, not a Christmas card, not a birthday card, nothing.
Philip's father moved to Monte Carlo with his mistress. The family fell apart. Philip was taken under the wing of his wealthy English relatives, the Mountbattens, who paid his school fees and took him in during holidays. In royal terms, Philip was a boy from the wrong side of the tracks. And Elizabeth was still only a child, and this just a crush. But Mountbatten, once bitten by an idea, never gave up. For now, there was a war to fight. But at the next suitable opportunity, Mountbatten was going to do everything he could to further a match and advance his own dynastic ambitions. 4 years of war had kept Prince Philip of Greece and Princess Elizabeth apart. By 1943, Philip was a lieutenant in the British Navy, mentioned in dispatches for bravery. Elizabeth was now a young woman of 17. She had spent most of her war cloistered away at Windsor Castle. Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, still hoped for a match between the pair. Christmas 1943 at Windsor. Elizabeth was playing Aladdin in the annual family pantomime. Among the guests was Philip. Elizabeth's governess noticed his effect on the princess and recorded it in her memoirs.
Lilibet came to see me looking rather pink. Who do you think's coming to see us at, Crawfie? Philip. I have never known Lilibet more animated. There was a sparkle about her none of us had ever seen before. Many people remarked on it.
Princess Elizabeth had led quite a restricted life. At Windsor, with doting parents, with animals and loving staff around her, but she hadn't seen the world. She was confronted by Prince Philip, someone who'd been about a bit. He was very exciting indeed. She was swept off her feet.
From then on, the 2 young people began to correspond. She took an immense interest in him, where he was and on what ship.
Mountbatten was delighted to hear about the renewed friendship between Elizabeth and Philip, both for his nephew and for himself. He was determined to do what he could to turn this into more than a passing attraction, and to this end, he would bring his own unique range of talents.
He was a man of extraordinary courage, both physical and moral. He was decent, he was generous, he was as good a person to have on your side if you were in trouble as you could possibly imagine. He was also the most monstrous cheat and liar. He found it very hard to distinguish between what he thought, what he wanted to be the truth, what actually was the truth.
Mountbatten was now Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, responsible for winning the war against Japan. But he was never too busy to take important family matters in hand. Philip's cousin, the King of Greece, was also in favour of the prestigious match. Mountbatten encouraged him to write to George VI, asking if Philip could become a suitor to Elizabeth. George VI's response? No. Mountbatten had overplayed his hand. He had underestimated something important. The close relationship between Elizabeth and her father. George VI was a shy, awkward man who relied heavily on his daughter's companionship, and he didn't want to let her go just yet.
The king was ambivalent about Philip. On the one hand, he liked the fact he was a naval officer. On the other hand, he had these possessive reservations about losing his daughter. I think the king was shocked at the idea that his daughter might have an independent, emotional, sexual life that she now wanted to pursue. It was much too early for him. He loved the little family unit.
With time, Mountbatten could deal with the king's possessiveness. But there was a far bigger obstacle ahead: Philip's unfortunate links with Nazi Germany.
There was no denying it. Prince Philip had German blood and German relatives. Of his sisters, all of them were married to German princelings. One of them had been married to an SS officer.
Philip's family had Germanic origins. They were members of the House of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg. Following the family breakup, all his sisters had reverted to a German identity. Sophie, Philip's youngest sister, married Prince Christoph of Hesse in 1930. He was made a colonel in Hitler's SS.
Teasingly, Queen Elizabeth called Prince Philip the Hun, and he pretended to be amused by it, but I think actually it rather niggled with him.
Let's not forget, this is a royal family that changed its German name to be called Windsor in the previous war. So to fit in with a family coming from Schlosses and boar hunts and Bavaria and so on, just, didn't make any sense at all.
For the royal family, Philip's Germanness at a time of war would be a public relations own goal. Mountbatten realised the only way to put his nephew in the running was if Philip's unwelcome foreign connections, both Greek and German, could be removed from the picture. Philip needed to become British. To get Philip naturalised as a British citizen, there was important groundwork for Mountbatten to do. In August 1944, he flew to Cairo, where he met the exiled King of Greece, Philip's cousin. Mountbatten persuaded him to allow Philip to abandon his Greek nationality. The plan was off to a good start. But back in Britain, there was something else afoot. Elizabeth's strong-minded mother had her own plans for her very marriageable daughter.
There's a wonderful story that the Queen Mother drew up a first 11 of contenders for her daughter. And as somebody said, she certainly didn't put in Philip to open the batting.
On the Queen's list were Charles, 10th Duke of Rutland, Johnny Dalkeith, the future Duke of Buccleuch, and Lord Porchester, a close friend of the princess. All these young men were heirs to vast estates and fortunes. Small parties were organised, and Elizabeth's parents kept their fingers tightly crossed. Mountbatten was going to have to work fast.
Today is Victory in Europe Day.
The end of the war with Germany in May 1945 meant things were looking up. Perhaps Philip's foreignness would not be such a problem now. Elizabeth had just turned 19 and was showing signs of an independent spirit.
I think we all said we must go out and join in the celebrations. London was just full of people screaming with joy. And luckily, the King and Queen allowed them to. Princess Elizabeth wore her ATS uniform, and with her cap on, nobody would have had a clue who she was. It was lovely for her. She could be completely anonymous.
Philip was still fighting in the Far East, where the war continued. Elizabeth and he were still corresponding. Despite the young aristocrats dangled in front of her, Elizabeth had not lost interest in the handsome naval officer, as her governess observed.
One day I suddenly became aware that she had his picture on her mantelpiece. Is that altogether wise? People will begin all sorts of gossip about you. She looked at the photograph for a moment thoughtfully. Oh dear, I suppose they will. The next time I went into her room, the picture had disappeared. In its place, there was another one. There you are, Crawfie. I defy anyone to recognise who that is, said Lilibet. He's completely incognito in that one.
So Philip is a little touch of naughtiness, not doing exactly what her parents want, but her quite firmly saying, I like this, I want this for myself, and I'm going to have it.
With Elizabeth standing up to her parents, things were looking up. But Mountbatten was in danger of overplaying his hand with Philip. His frequent letters of advice ran the risk of putting his headstrong nephew off the match. Philip liked Elizabeth, but there were times when he resisted his uncle's interference. I am not being rude, but it is apparent that you like the idea of being the general manager of this little show, Philip later warned him. Mountbatten was also chivying George VI, to much better effect. The king had not agreed to the match, but he had agreed to talk to his government about the need to naturalise Philip and make him a British citizen. But now there was a fresh obstacle looming in Mountbatten's path: the government itself. Earlier that year, a new socialist government had swept to power, led by Clement Attlee.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy.
The new government had inherited a dirty little war in Greece.
If there was one country one wouldn't particularly have wanted a suitor to the princess to be coming from at that particular moment for a Labour government, it was Greece.
Philip's Greek antecedents were now a real problem. Greece's bitter civil war loomed. On one side, the communists, on the other side, the pro-monarchy right, who wanted to reinstate Philip's family on the throne. Britain was caught between the two.
It was a war to the death, really, as civil wars always are. We didn't want the communists to take over because the Cold War had begun, and we didn't want to see the Russians controlling Greece, but we didn't want the monarchy either.
British troops had been fighting to prevent the Greek communists from taking over the country. Labour Party left-wing backbenchers were increasingly appalled, accusing the government of supporting Greece's authoritarian far right.
Naturalising Philip would have sent a signal to people generally, and particularly to the Labour left, that the Labour government had thrown in its lot completely with the Greek royal family and with the right in Greece.
Faced with the prospect of backbench rebellion and diplomatic trouble, Attlee told the king that naturalising Philip could not be considered until the Greek situation had stabilised. International politics were now holding the match back. What would Dickie Mountbatten do next? Forgotten story of a royal love match fraught with a series of obstacles, and how, through behind-the-scenes manipulation, Philip's Uncle Dickie helped pull it off. Just. The story begins in 1939. Elizabeth, in the eyes of her family, courtiers and the public, the young Prince Philip of Greece was a far from ideal. Rough, uneducated and not likely to be faithful, thought the court. Rather unpolished, Teutonic, Charlie Kraut. In a newspaper poll, nearly half the nation was against the match.
Definitely no to a marriage with a foreign prince.
But luckily for the couple, there was a third person in this romance. Philip's Uncle Dickie, Lord Louis Mountbatten, fixer extraordinaire. This is the forgotten. This November, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary. Theirs is one royal marriage that has stood the test of time and helps keep the monarchy secure. But back in the 1940s, When the teenage Elizabeth fell for the dashing Philip, it was a very different story. Was 13 years old, the heir to the throne, and a serious-minded girl of strong feelings. Prince Philip of Greece was 18, a handsome young sailor of uncertain prospects. And Lord Louis Mountbatten, Philip's uncle, was a very ambitious man with a passion for intrigue.